welcome to Product Footprint Live. We cover off today what is a product carbon footprint, so we'll make sure we've all got a firm understanding of what we're here to talk about in the first place. We'll look at why they're important. Should we be doing product carbon footprints, and why should we undertake this for our products, for our customers, for all of the reasons. We'll look at the mechanics of it. How do you assess a product carbon footprint? What's the approach? What's the methodology? How best to undertake this sort of exercise? We're going to touch on some regulations and legislation, some compliance areas for you all that might affect some of you, might affect all of you eventually, of course, because these things are always changing. We'll look at standards and best practice, so how to ensure that you're doing everything properly and as well as you can be, how to demonstrate that, and especially in the context of meeting those compliance areas that we had just mentioned. We will touch on carbon neutrality and net zero, and we'll look at carbon neutral products and what that means for you, for your products, again, for your customers, and for climate change, of course. We'll then spend a little bit of time on green claims, how important it is to get that right, looking at integrity and credibility and everything that you say about the activity that you're doing, the product itself, and or any associated activity that is working towards addressing climate change as well. There'll be time for a short Q&A at the end, so again, do drop your questions into the chat, and we will endeavour to answer those, and then we'll wrap things up, and that should take us to around 10:30 this morning. But before we dive into all of that good fun stuff, we're going to have a quick look at the poll that you folks have been happily filling in for the last few minutes. Okay, so this is great. We've got some of you have answered some of the questions on the poll there. We've got some responses, so let's take a quick look at that. Thank you very much for joining in with this. Question 1, have you measured any of your products' carbon emissions yet? More or less 50-50 split here, more or less. We've got half the people here saying yes, we have. So hopefully you're here to learn a little bit more about, I guess, next steps. You know, you've measured your product's emissions. What do you do with that information? Where do you take it? We've got people who have not yet done this but are hoping to, and that's again, great place to start. So this is finding out how to start, where to start, who to start with, etc. So really good to see that there. We've got the piece. Question 2, what is your primary interest in product footprinting? So a bit of a why are we here? Large proportion of us wanting to reduce the emissions of our offerings and to disclose those emissions to customer supply chain. That between the two of those items, definitely the most weighted reasons to be here, but also quite heavy on the comparison with competitors. So not only wanting to reduce your emissions and improve your product, but of course improve it to the point of being even better and gaining that competitive edge. Certainly something we'd all be keen to do, I'm sure. What are we currently using to measure product footprints? So if you are doing them currently, what is your approach? Half of you there using a spreadsheet, probably DIY, bringing that in-house, getting the data and doing the calculations. A couple of people using some software, that's interesting to see, and some people, of course, using a third party, independent party, i.e. employing another organization to undertake this on your behalf. All very valid. Does your business export or sell to the EU? Again, we are sort of more or less 50-50 there. So half of you are already doing this with there is a little bit of planning too in the future there. It's really good to see. We're going to talk on some of the EU regulations a little bit later, so we'll prick your ears up for that, because that will be important. And recognizing the difference between the terms carbon neutral and net zero. Of course, for the most part here, I think people either do recognize that difference or they're not sure what the difference is. Certainly nobody is telling us here that there is no difference, which is good to see, because we'll touch on that a little bit later as well and understand exactly what that means in the context of your products in particular. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Tom Vaughan here. I'll introduce Tom. Tom is going to talk to us about what a product carbon footprint is.
Thank you, Dan. So hopefully a lot of you might already know, and you just need a refresher, but so a product carbon footprint measures the full life cycle of your product. So from raw material extraction, so the embodied emissions of those raw materials, transporting them from the supplier to your factory where they're manufactured, and then we account for the electricity and any other energy use in the manufacturing process, and then distributing those products from your factory to your clients and customers, and then also the use of product if that is relevant. So for an example, a car, you would account for the petrol, diesel use, and the expected life expectancy of the vehicle over its lifespan, and then the disposal of the product, so if it's recycled or goes to landfill. So these are often measured in kilograms or grams of CO2e per unit or product, so often per kilogram of product or for one whole product, such as the whole car. And also a key difference, so you might have heard the term LCA, life cycle assessment. So that often measures a lot of different environmental impacts, so water use, and in land use change. So they're a bit different from product carbon footprints. So we only measure the carbon side of a product carbon footprint, whereas a full life cycle assessment will assess all these other environmental impacts, but the term is often used interchangeably. So why might you want to assess your carbon footprint, and why are they important? So there's a few benefits of doing so. Firstly, environmental benefits. So you can identify and reduce carbon emission hotspots. So this is a good way of addressing any low-hanging fruit, any easy reductions in your emissions. And then so by reducing your footprint of your product every year, so ideally you'd assess your product every 2 years and hopefully make some changes in reducing these emissions. So this will overall contribute to mitigating climate change. And then there's some good business benefits as well, enhancing brand reputation and customer loyalty. You will gain a competitive edge in the market. So it's getting increasingly popular to assess your carbon footprint, and you'll just stand out in the market. And a lot of you might have to assess your footprint to comply with regulations, which we'll touch on later. So the EU, if you're exporting to the EU, you'll often be asked to measure your footprint to comply with their regulations. And you might also be pressured by your customers to provide them with a measure of your product's carbon footprint, so they can use it for their own sustainability and net zero targets. And that's quite a common one for consumer demand. So now, how to assess your carbon footprint. So there's multiple methods of doing so. So if you know you've got quite a simple product with only a few materials and a few suppliers, you can do it in-house and do it yourself. So you could use an Excel spreadsheet, collect all the data yourself. And one thing to look out for when doing it yourself is having access to these emission factors. So to work out the embodied carbon of the raw materials, you'll need to use a database. So EcoInvent is a common one, and these you do have to pay for an annual fee. So that's something to be aware of. And also, ideally, you'd get your in-house calculations verified by a third-party consultant, just to check they're all correct. Common way of assessing your footprint is through a consultant. So you'd work with a consultant, they'd have access to all these databases like EcoInvent. They'd ask you what sort of data they need. So getting data from your manufacturer about their kilowatt hour consumption. And then they do all the calculations for you in a bespoke tool. And they'd write the report and you'd get it all laid out for you. And then another way is there's a lot of software out there for LCA assessments. So common ones are Gabi, One-Click LCA, and OpenLCA. And they do vary in cost. So Gabi is often quite expensive and often used for more full life cycle assessments. And OpenLCA is an open source software, so it's free to use. But again, you have to pay for the databases, and it's not very user friendly. You do have to have some training to use it. But yeah, those are the three main methods of assessing your footprint. So once you've decided your method, you have to select the scope and decide the scope of your assessment. So either cradle to gate or cradle to grave. So cradle to gate covers only the upstream emissions of the product. So from the raw material extraction up to your factory, and then including the transportation of those raw materials to your factory. And cradle to grave, on the other hand, assesses your full life cycle. So from the factory to the disposal as well. So everything from raw material extraction to end of life and use of the product, if that's relevant. And there might be different reasons. So you might be asked to, from a customer, they'd want the full cradle to grave assessment. Or maybe if you're complying to certain regulations, they'll only ask for cradle to gate. And often you might find it difficult to collect all the data for a full cradle to grave assessment, depending on the nature of your product. So for example, clothing, it can be difficult. You have to make a lot of assumptions on the use. So how often are they washed, and the expected lifespan of the clothing. So now we're going to look at an example of a product life cycle assessment of a wine bottle, so full cradle to grave, using one of our tools. So this is a tool that often a consultant would use. So on an Excel spreadsheet, you would say product name is a wine bottle. You'd then list the raw materials that are used in the wine bottle, and often the packaging is included. So in this case, a wooden box for the wine, and then list the weights of each of the raw materials to equal the full weight of your product. And then what we do is we'd find an emission factor. So EcoInvent is the most commonly used one for product footprints. And you'd find the most relevant match to these. So again, you do have to pay if you're going to do this yourself. There's an annual fee for EcoInvent. And then these will calculate the raw material emissions, so the first stage of the life cycle. You then want to assess the transport of the raw material to your factory. So in this case, for example, the recycled glass is traveling by van to a train station in Berlin, and then it's rail freighted to Paris, and then another van to the winery. And you'd do this for each. So ideally you'd have the supplier location and then the transport by each leg ending up in the winery in Paris. And then to calculate the manufacturing emissions, you'd ask the factory how many kilowatt hours does it take to manufacture one product. So this can be quite often difficult data to get, and it's quite often you'll need to make assumptions basically on the annual kilowatt hour of the factory you can get, and then apportion that to how many products it's made in a year. But yeah, this can be quite tricky. So, and then you can see the factory emissions if you select the country your factory is located in. So if, for example, it's Germany instead, it uses the local electricity factors to calculate the emissions.
Tom, if somebody's doing this themselves, all of these factors, I know you've mentioned EcoInvent for the material factors. There are other databases available, aren't there?
Yes, so DEFRA is another common one. So DEFRA is often used for the distances in certain materials like paper.
Similarly, I think you can find a number of material factors on CADI, which is also a good place to find the international electricity factors as well, yes?
Yep, so CADI, our carbon database, you can access all them for free. So it will have the international electricity factors to calculate these factory emissions, and also a lot of the material ones to calculate these embodied raw materials. So there are definitely a lot of places you can find these, and yeah, our carbon database CADI is a place to look. So once you've assessed all this is the cradle to gate emissions. And if you want to do the full life cycle, we'd then have to calculate gate to grave. So the transport from the winery in Paris, and in this case, the wine bottles going to New York by air freight. So it gets on different legs, shipped to the airport and then flown to JFK. And you can apportion it by, if you've got multiple customers, you can apportion it by percentage there. And a wine bottle for the disposal emissions is fairly straightforward to calculate. So obviously you'd recycle the glass bottle. So 100% of that glass will go and be locally recycled. And in this case, these emission factors are from DEFRA. So again, free to access if you want to do this at home in-house. And then it will spit out the emissions for the disposal. And then here are the results. So you've got the different stages of the life cycle. It's split out. So in this case, a lot of the emissions, 72%, are from the distribution of the product. And like I said before, a good reason why you'd want to assess your footprint is now you can see this hotspot here. So why is the distribution so high? And we can see it's because we've shipped it by air, and air freight is very carbon intensive. So maybe for next year we've decided, well, let's switch this to sea freight, much lower carbon intensity, and then we can see the results. So it went from 7 kilos of CO2 to now only 2.2 kilos of CO2 per wine bottle. Yeah, per wine bottle. So a quick change like that, often sea freight is cheaper to ship anyway, so you'll make some cost savings, and you'll reduce your carbon footprint. So, and then every 2 years you'd reassess.
That's brilliant. And as we just mentioned, there are several databases available for getting access to those factors. I know Tom's mentioned CADI, the Carbon Database Initiative, that I think Wendy's dropped a link to in the chat there. CADI is a good place to start, especially for the electricity emission factors, but also a good number of material factors there as well. And of course, DEFRA, that Tom's mentioned a couple of times, freely available from the UK government's website. So there is a lot of readily available information there if you're just sort of starting out in this arena. Sorry, Tom, carry on.
So again, here's the split of the emissions in the table. So often, if you're complying to any regulations, they'll ask for this split. So this is following the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is universally recognized for product footprints. And like I said, if you want to only do cradle to grave, you'd stop at energy manufacturing, so the factory. And here the pie chart just shows, yeah, so the distribution of raw materials is often quite low, but obviously it will vary product by product. One key difference is your factory location. So if it was in Germany, like you saw previously, the emissions go up because they happen to use a lot of coal for their electricity.
And Tom, just to interrupt there, what if my products are not tangible like a wine bottle? What if in fact it's more of a service related product? For example, a lot of financial institutions refer to their mortgages or their loans as products. Can these products be footprinted as well?
Yeah, definitely. So it's a bit different to assessing a tangible based product. So for example, a good example is maybe a delivery service. So instead of assessing the raw materials, you'd assess the diesel consumed in the delivery truck, or if it's a cloud-based service like Google, the emissions associated with the data centers and energy consumption, and that's quite often apportioned to how much the user uses that service. So they'll calculate the total emissions of that total service and apportion it by user.
Okay, so whether my product is physical or whether my product is in fact a service that I'm delivering to my customers, assessing the footprint is still just as viable.
Definitely, yes, yeah. So you've assessed, you've got your results. What now? So if you decide to do it in-house, ideally you'd get your results certified by a third party, and they would look through the data and just verify that it's all correct. You'd disclose your emissions, so that results table you could provide to your customers if they're using it for their own organizational footprint. You could provide the full grams of CO2 per product ideally you'd use your first assessment as your benchmark for future assessments. So every 2 years, we would update it. Every year they release updated versions of the eco and vent factors. So every year they're more accurate. And obviously you want to see the changes in all the actions you made, so any reductions. So for example, that switching air freight to sea freight and see that reduction. Yeah, and prioritize those carbon hotspots. And if you're making any green claims in your marketing of the product, you want to be able to back these up with that data. And we will touch on that later on. And like I said, Caddy. So we've got a Caddy Live coming up, Caddy Live event coming up, which you can scan that QR code and it will take you to the sign up page. So now we'll look at regulations and legislation. So one of a big reason why you'd assess your carbon footprint. So there's lots of industry specific compliance. So these are just a few of them. So if your industry is a paper industry, you might have to report to SEPI, and they often will ask for different scopes depending on the compliance, so either cradle to gate or cradle to grave. And I would suggest you have a look at yourselves, at your own industries, and just make sure that you're complying and decide on the scope that way if you need to.
This is certainly worth doing a little bit of homework on. As it says here, by no means an exhaustive list. All sorts of different industries and areas of business have their own ideas, whether they be rules or guidelines to follow, but certainly what is deemed by those industry experts to be best practice. We work with several customers in particular in the paper and construction industry in these examples who have to follow these guidelines and adhere to those. They're broadly all telling the same story, but it's good to know what the specifics are for your area of work.
And then there's a common one. The EU are very progressive in this, and they've releasing. So this is early days, but the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this is if you're exporting to the EU, and it's only just in its phase 2 from January next year. But basically it will address any carbon intensive material. So if your product's made from these items listed, these materials listed, so iron and steel, fertilizer, aluminium, cement, hydrogen. So these are very carbon intensive materials, and you'll have to report. So you'll have to get your product assessed and fill in a compliance form with those cradle to gate emissions. And they'll gradually phase in more products with different materials as it goes on. You can see the timeline there from 2034 onwards. But like I said, it's in its early phases at the moment.
It is, and the interesting thing about CBAM is that the onus that the EU puts on the EU importer. So the compliance issue really lies with the business in the EU doing the importing. If you're exporting to the EU, whilst this isn't your responsibility, what it does give you is an opportunity to certainly have that competitive edge. So if you can provide the data that is needed more readily and more easily for your customers to be compliant and meet their legislative responsibility, then that will give you a competitive edge. And as Tom said, starting from January, the carbon tax process is going to kick off on the EU side, and they'll start to gradually phase in different materials until all products are falling under the CBAM umbrella in 2034.
And then another EU legislation is the Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, ESPR. So again, it's in its very early stages, but ideally what will happen is they'll introduce a digital product passport. So this will be in the form of a QR code essentially on your product, which you can scan, and it will provide different sustainability data. So as a result from your product footprint, it will have the grams of CO2, how easily recyclable it is, how easily repairable it is, and you'd change the design of the product to meet this criteria. Yeah, and like I said, the environmental impacts. So this is gradually being phased in. You can see the timeline there, but it's, like I said, in its early phases.
And these, of course, are just two examples. So, this, again, by no means exhaustive. This is just to touch on the fact that legislation and regulations are changing, not just for organizations in terms of their measurement and reduction and disclosure of their carbon footprints and emissions, but for products as well. This is leaping forward. In fact, there's almost an argument to suggest that there's a much more pressure in the area of product footprinting, because this is very much consumer driven. The end users are more concerned with the environmental impact of the products that they're purchasing and they're choosing to put their faith in, even more so than those of the organizations behind the product, so to speak. So actually it is really important to get this right. And these changes, CBAM, ESPR, they are the tip of the iceberg. The rest of the world will follow suit. I'm sure we'll see very similar emerging regulations in the UK in the not too distant future as well. And Joe Public is being very demanding of this. So this needs to be taken quite seriously. Which brings us quite nicely to the area of standards and best practice. And we're going to look at just a few suggestions here. This is a little bit of a whistle stop, but we're going to look in particular at some of the ISO standards, the ISO, of course, being globally recognized, and plenty of organizations are very quick to boast about their ISO accreditations. How many of you are ISO 9001, ISO 14001, ISO 50001 even, because these are badges that we need to wear as businesses, and they are demonstrating our credibility and our integrity in everything that we do as a business, and our customers are quite demanding of that, and they like to see us wearing these badges. So in exactly the same way, the ISO standard can be a fantastic benefit to your product, and in demonstrating the credibility and integrity of all the work you're doing to improve that product and its sustainability and its impact on climate change. The first, of course, is ISO 14067. This is the main one. So certainly suggesting that following this would be best practice, the framework for quantifying and reporting the carbon footprint of a product. It does what it says on the tin. ISO 14067 is a great way to just sense check everything that you're doing and make sure that you are adhering to Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and that you're meeting all of the requirements and being able to demonstrate with evidence, sort of verifiable evidence, that everything is above board and all the calculations are as they should be. So whether you are doing this yourself in-house, if you're assessing your own product footprints, you might want to get hold of a copy of this standard and ensure that you're following the standard in your calculations. Certainly if you are having a third party undertake this work for you. If you're engaging with an outside organisation, a consultancy, for example, who are completing the work for you, then you do want to be ensuring that they are completing the work to ISO 14067. This is certainly recognised all through the EU and in most of the rest of the world. So it's easily the best way to make sure that we're getting it right. Adjacent to that, there are a couple of other standards that are worth considering, and we'll touch on some of their relevance in a moment. ISO 14021 is all about environmental labels and declarations. So once you've done all of this good work, what exactly can you say on your packaging and in your advertising to promote the fact that you've done all this good work? And how do you go about making these claims to your customers and stakeholders to make sure that they're fully satisfied and everything that's being said is having all of your I's dotted and your T's crossed, etc. It's a great way to check that you are avoiding any greenwashing while still proudly declaring everything that you've been doing to improve the product. ISO 14021. And lastly, ISO 14068. This is the new transition to net zero. It's very recent. It's a part one of a two-parter. So ISO 14068 part one is all about being able to achieve and demonstrate carbon neutrality. There is a part two coming, and part two is expected in November this year, which will be all about achieving and demonstrating net zero. So watch this space, all eyes on November to see how that pans out. But in the meantime, today and tomorrow and for the time being, 14068 part one is the way to go when demonstrating carbon neutrality, whether that be in your organization or in your product, then that's certainly the way to go. This mentions a couple of key words here in terms of carbon offsetting if you are looking to achieve that carbon neutrality. So how carbon offsetting must be permanent, measurable, additional. We'll be touching on that in just a second as well. There we are, carbon neutral and net zero products. So once you have measured your product and once you understand your product carbon footprint and you're doing everything you can to reduce it, there is every reason to then go ahead and look at carbon offsetting, a way to counteract the emissions that are being caused, a way to further your product when done properly to the right standards as potentially being a carbon neutral product. We can see here we've looked at a couple of definitions. We asked the question at the top of the meeting there if there was an understandable difference between carbon neutral and net zero. Of course there is, and the crux of it is that I think carbon neutral, of course, has been around for much longer. Net zero is, of course, a more modern term, and certainly the current ambition and goal of most organizations and countries and nations around the world to achieve that net zero target by 2050. Carbon neutral, a much simpler statement, making or resulting in no net release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, especially as a result of carbon offsetting. And whether you're looking at the very current and very comprehensive ISO standard, the 14068, or even when you look at more traditional standards such as BSI's PAS 2060 that you might be familiar with, that's been around for a long time now, you're essentially talking about having to undertake three things. One is an independently measured, or certainly at least independently verified, calculation of your product's emissions. The second is about disclosure, so having a plan to reduce those emissions and making that publicly available. And lastly, of course, to offset the emissions that have been calculated, those residual emissions that have already been caused. The key here in is to understand that whether you're looking at the traditional standards like PAS 2060 or whether you're looking at the ISO 14068, it's all about the credibility and the integrity of the carbon offsetting that you choose. So any carbon offsetting undertaken to achieve carbon neutral products should be independently verified by a recognized body and meet some specific criteria, namely the criteria of additionality, permanence, measurability, and leakage. We've put a little description here on the slides. Of course, you'll get access to these slides after the event and you'll get a recording of the session. So I won't bore you all with reading that word for word, but these recognized bodies that do the independent verification of the carbon offsetting projects, they're verified Carbon Standard by Verra, the VCS, the Gold Standard. These are the two sort of longest standing, probably most credible bodies going. Puro Earth, we've mentioned there, they're new to this area, but they're doing pretty much the same thing in terms of their quality checks, and they are looking at all of this for you. So in essence, if you're finding a VCS or gold standard project to support with your carbon offsetting, you are assured that they meet the additionality, permanence, measurability, and leakage criteria, all listed here. That's just something to make your lives that little bit easier. And what does that mean for your green claims? So this is all about ensuring the integrity and credibility of the things that we talk about. Well, we've got a couple of points, and again, by no means exhaustive. But here in the UK, of course, we've got the Advertising Standards Authority. They have guidance on green claims, talking about an emphasis on the need for truthfulness, accuracy, and clarity. In particular, they focus on being able to demonstrate evidence and to substantiate claims that are a little loose, like sustainable or environmentally friendly. They're looking for something a little bit more robust than that, with substantiating evidence to support it. And everything that we've talked about today in terms of proper measurement with proper emission factors, independently verified by a third party, to the ISO standards, meeting the ISO standards wherever that might be applicable, and of course to be, if you do go down the road of carbon neutral product, to be offsetting that with independently verified, credible projects. All of that is the sort of substantiating evidence that the likes of the ACA are looking for, doing things properly. Worth a read. The misleading claims and social responsibility advertising guidance is freely available online, so certainly worth looking at in terms of how you're going to promote and shout about your business here in the UK. Similarly, across the pond, the European Commission, the EU have their Green Claims Directive protecting consumers from greenwashing. It takes a very, very similar position. So again, companies need to substantiate their claims with verifiable evidence for any standards, especially relating to environmental labeling. They need to ensure transparent communication and so on. This is about protecting consumers from greenwashing, but certainly, we want to make sure that we're very clear that to avoid greenwashing, this isn't about choosing green hushing. We don't want to say nothing for fear of getting it wrong. What we want to do is say everything because we're getting it right and doing it right. And as I've said, with the accurate measurement, with the independent verification, following the standards that we've described here today, using the databases that we've talked about here today, and choosing the methods and approach to offsetting, if we go down that road that we've talked about here today, then we have absolutely done everything right, and there is no greenwashing to be scared of. So again, worth a read. The directive is freely available online, and if you're exporting to the EU or selling into the EU, advertising in the EU, certainly worth knowing what that has to say about the fact. the headlines are just as we've said here. So in terms of your green claims, ensure that anything you do say about the good work that you're doing is very clear and specific. We would certainly recommend having your work verified by a third party, at least. Make sure that you've got all of the numbers to back it up and the evidence to support such an assessment. Make sure that any offsetting undertaken for carbon neutrality ticks the boxes that we've already talked about there in terms of integrity and transparency. Those are all of the things that we definitely should be doing. Avoid any loose terms like sustainable or environmentally friendly product. That's not really telling the consumer what they need to know. Similarly, anything that's not backed by that third-party verification is very easily questioned and scrutinized, and if you only tell half the story as well, very easily questioned and scrutinized. That's the best way to look at things. Stick to telling the whole story as clearly, specifically, and as honestly as you can. Do everything right in the first place, and there is nothing to worry about. So we're approaching the end of the session here, folks. Just as a summary here, we've looked at what a product carbon footprint is, and why they're so important. So we've talked about why we should be doing this, and we should be doing this. If you're still asking that question, should we be looking at assessing the carbon footprints of our products? I think the answer is probably yes. 9 times out of 10 it's going to be yes. There might be some very small case examples where actually you're sort of a micro business with such small numbers in terms of product and distribution that actually making a contribution to some other environmental project like a tree planting program or something like that might be more suitable and more appropriate for your marketing needs. But certainly anybody who's got customers asking these questions or might have a need to look at some of the compliance areas that we've talked about today or in the future should be looking at product carbon footprints. They're very, very important. They're going to be even more important going forward, and so better to get ahead of that game rather than be on a back foot and suddenly need to have all of this yesterday. We've looked at how to assess a product carbon footprint. So Tom took us through the little demonstration there with the wine bottle, and we talked about emission factors and materials and where you can find those emission factors, the various databases that are available. Well, we've talked about some of the regulation and legislation, but certainly how important that is and how it's increasing around the world. We've looked at some of the standards that are out there and are available, in particular the ISO standards. Other standards are available, of course, but certainly this is what we'd recommend, starting with 14067 as best practice, as a framework to look at a product carbon footprint from start to finish. We've touched on what carbon neutral products looks like, and we've mentioned how to go about addressing this in your own green claims. We asked the question, why are product footprints important? And in the same breath, should we be looking at carbon footprints for our products? I think we've established that certainly in most cases, in 9 out of 10 cases, the answer to that question is yes, we should. For all of the reasons, we should be doing this because it's about improving our products and improving sustainability and addressing climate change. We should be doing this because it's going to help us meet legislation and regulations either now or in the future, and we should be doing this because our customers are becoming increasingly demanding of it, and if we want to keep that competitive edge and if we want to satisfy those customers, then we absolutely should be providing this information in the very transparent, very credible way that we've described here today. There are perhaps some examples where it's less appropriate. If you were a much smaller business, if you were talking about much smaller numbers in terms of quantities of products or distribution, I'm thinking of if your business is hand making dream catchers in your spare bedroom that you sell maybe a dozen of a year. I'm exaggerating the point a little bit, but such a small business operation as that might not necessarily benefit from a full product carbon footprint assessment, and it might be more appropriate that instead perhaps a contribution is made to some sustainability projects such as tree planting, local tree planting, that sort of thing. But in most cases, certainly the answer is yes, we should be looking at the carbon footprints of our products. We do have time now for a little Q&A. So I did have a question emailed to me actually. Somebody was asking in terms of product footprinting and having to reassess every 2 years. What's the rationale behind that exactly? And if their product isn't changing, doesn't change, hasn't changed in years, it's a very traditional product, they've always made it that way, they're probably always going to make it that way. What benefit does the reassessment bring to them?
Yeah, definitely. So the idea behind reassessing every 2 years, even though your product hasn't changed, is that it's important to update the emission factors. So these are released every year. They're updated, and they're a lot more accurate. Well, they improve the accuracy every year and take into account different changes in electricity factors. So as countries change their grid to more renewable sources, hopefully you'll see those manufacturing emissions go down.
And how about Tom, if we have several similar products that are more often than not using the same or similar materials just in different quantities, is there sort of an economy of scale? Would it be simpler to assess all of these products sort of as one, or what's the best approach to that sort of scenario?
Yeah, definitely. So the tool I showcased just now, you can do multiple products. If they're all similar, they just have different quantities of material, but all the same materials, same logistics. You can kind of assess them all at once. Just be careful that there's nothing too major in the changes, because they would count as separate products. So maybe if it was just a slightly different color and there's like a 0.01% difference in the material makeup, then yeah, you can safely claim that as one product. But yeah, as long as you're transparent with the scope and provide that report with all the details, you'll be fine.
Thanks, Tom. Another question: how does, in terms of the difference that you mentioned earlier between a full LCA and a product carbon footprint, these regulations and legislation that are here today, so notwithstanding what might come down the road in the future, but that's here with us today, such as the CBAM or the ESPR, does a simple product carbon footprint certainly give everything that we need to meet those regulations and the requirements, or would a full LCA offer anything over and above that might be needed from a compliance point of view?
Yeah, that's a good question. So ESPR do mention other aspects, so other environmental impacts that you would get from a full LCA. I'm not too sure on the details as of yet, and they're constantly changing and deciding, the EU, about what that could entail. In terms of CBAM, they do ask for mostly carbon intensity, so a carbon footprint will help adhere to that compliance. Dan, do you know any Any
No,
further details for CBAM?
Certainly on the CBAM front, I think it's carbon all the way. So the product carbon footprint would give you everything that was needed for that. And even in a cradle to gate scenario, I think a product carbon footprint would give you everything you needed for that as well, because CBAM strangely doesn't account for the downstream distribution of product.
So how do you go about calculating the carbon footprint of a product that is made up of hundreds and thousands of components? Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah. So basically it's very expensive. So often, for a good example, a car product footprint, which some car manufacturers do. So Polestar, an electric vehicle company, they do a very good annual LCA of a full life cycle assessment of their vehicle. But this would cost thousands and thousands of pounds. It's a very big project. You have to have a lot of resources because obviously, yeah, you've got hundreds of suppliers. So it is very difficult to fully assess a very large, complex product. So you'd have to use, a consultant or the LCA software like Gabi, which can cost thousands of pounds. If you want to do your own in-house, then obviously it'd have to be much simpler. So basic materials like paper, you could potentially do. But it is possible to do complex projects that just cost a lot of resources and time. Another question. We are an organization that does not manufacture. We install products and clients are requesting carbon and information. Is there a way for us to relatively easily generate carbon information for products where the manufacturer does not have an EPD?
I don't know about easily, and there are a lot of people in this position where they are essentially retailing goods, purchasing wholesale and retailing those goods, and so your customers are being demanding, but it's not really your place to put the information on the product necessarily. Certainly, though, we've worked with lots of people in this sort of position, and the best practice is to try to work closely with the manufacturer to get as much accurate data as you can in order to complete an assessment. Some assumptions can be made. You can make some assumptions. You can make some estimations, and we can, or I say we, your consultant of choice, but working with your supplier to get that data and to agree on what those estimations or assumptions could or should look like is key. And it would encourage them as well to do more of it at their end, so that going forward in the future, you've got you're more likely to get that data coming out with products. These conversations need to be continued, because much in the same way as your customers are being demanding of you, you should of course be just as demanding of you.
There's mentioned cradle to gate engrave. What about cradle to cradle? Can we not benchmark locally sourced products as opposed to importing the same in cradle to cradle terms? I'm not sure what you mean. In terms of locally sourced products, I mean, that should be reported. So if they're locally sourced to your factory, then obviously there'll be a shorter emission in the transport. So the transport of raw materials will be lower. So that will show up in your results. So it's a good example of a potential change you could make in the logistics of your product to reduce your footprint, is source more local materials for your product to shorten those transport routes.
Definitely. Local resources, local materials is always a good recommendation. As well as everything that you've mentioned about reducing air freight, sea freight, etc., like that. But using product carbon footprinting tools to potentially model out scenarios is also a great practice. So in the example that Tom showed, you could, much in the same way as we demonstrated the difference between air and sea freight, you could say, well, right now we're getting our corks from this place in Germany. What if we were to instead get our corks from somewhere in Dorset, and look at what difference that made to the footprint. So we have come to the end of the session. We are now at time. So thank you all very, very much for your time. I am going to just mention that we do have further sessions coming up. The Net Zero Standard Live is the next session that we'll be hosting. That's on Friday, the 23rd of May. The Net Zero Standard is a new standard to adhere to in terms of having your organization, your business look at achieving net zero, aspiring to net zero, having net zero targets in place, and tracking and demonstrating your progress towards those targets. So do have a quick look at that. There's a QR code there to register for Net Zero Standard Live, which is on Friday the 23rd of May. We also, in June, so Friday the 13th of June, we have our CADI live session. CADI, the Carbon Database Initiative. We've mentioned CADI in the session today as a great resource for finding emissions factors, international electricity emissions factors, or material emissions factors. It's a great resource for all things carbon, really. There's public disclosures to talk about with CADI. Your organizations perhaps could be disclosing on CADI. You might find that your competitors are disclosing on CADI, and you might be able to get some interesting insight there. Certainly some good benchmarking information. But most importantly, and new to the CADI platform, is all about supply chain calculations. So if you're interested in assessing the supply chain of your business and including that in the scope of your own carbon emissions calculations and disclosures, then do check out the CADI live session on Friday the 13th of June. Again, there's a QR code just there. You can jump on that and register for that event well in advance. Get it in your diary. Other than that, I'll say thank you all very much for joining, and you all have a fantastic weekend.